On the 24th of November 1944, at Chofu Airfield outside Tokyo, Major Teruhiko Kobayashi watched the 244th Sentai fighters run their engines beneath a pale winter sky. Fuel smoke hung low over the field. Above it, the first American bombers were approaching at a height his pilots could see, but could not yet reach. The fighters lifted from Chofu in hard climbing turns, their engines straining toward a formation beyond their guns. Kobayashi commanded Tokyo's home defense fighter unit, and his men placed their faith in interception and deliberate ramming. Pilots of the 244th Sentai said, "Let them come. No formation crosses Tokyo twice." They committed themselves to break the attack over their capital, even if a fighter had to strike a bomber with its body. That morning, 111 B-29s had been dispatched against Tokyo. The vow was still intact as the fighters climbed. The confidence at Chofu was already facing an American force that had crossed the Pacific and reached Tokyo from Saipan. 21 Bomber Command had made the capital part of a target system whose reach extended far beyond the fighters waiting on the home islands. By August 1945, Tokyo's refuge in the sky would be gone, and the 244th Sentai's mission would end with Japan's defeat. The first strike mattered because it placed the defenders inside a new kind of war. Tokyo was no distant industrial objective viewed on a staff map. It was the city beneath Kobayashi's field, the city his unit had been assigned to cover, and the city now reached by American bombers flying from the Marianas. Every approaching formation turned the runways at Chofu into an alarm point. Every launch forced the 244th to wager its aircraft and pilots against bombers that could depart, disappear into the horizon, and return again on another day. The B-29 was not merely an intruder over Japanese airspace. It was proof that distance no longer protected the capital. From Saipan, the American force had carried the war to Tokyo itself. The 244th could still scramble. Its pilots could still climb. They could still believe that a determined attack, pressed close enough, could scatter an enemy formation before its bombs fell. Yet their airfield was now connected to a route that began on islands far out in the Pacific. The burden was not shared equally. The men at Chofu waited under the same sky as the capital. They had to be ready when morning came, ready when engines had to be started, ready when a formation appeared too high for an easy attack. The Americans did not need Chofu. Their bombers had come from Saipan, struck Tokyo, and headed back across open water. The fighters defending the city had nowhere else to take their responsibility. In January, Guam received a new commander for 21 Bomber Command. Major General Curtis E. LeMay inherited the task of carrying American air power across the Pacific against Japan. On the Japanese side, the meaning was plain. The force that had reached Tokyo had not spent itself in one morning. The 244th's men had said no formation would cross Tokyo twice. On the 20th of January 1945, LeMay took command on Guam. The capital had already been reached from an American base beyond the horizon. Over the Musashino Aircraft Works, the first B-29s held their course, while the 244th Sentai fought upward beneath them. The winter air sharpened the distance between the Japanese fighters and the bombers above. Kobayashi's pilots had launched from Chofu, with the capital behind them. Now they were climbing toward an enemy that had arrived at an altitude, exposing the limits of their performance and the reach of their weapons. The formation did not offer the kind of fight the defenders had imagined. It was high, remote, and moving steadily over Tokyo's industrial ground. The Japanese pilots could see the bombers. Seeing them was not the same as reaching them. Each minute in the climb spent fuel and strength. Each moment below the formation left the promised attack unfinished. The B-29 carried a service ceiling of 850 feet. Above Musashino, that height was no abstract figure. It was the vertical space between the fighters assigned to defend Tokyo and the American aircraft passing over it. At Chofu, ground crews and staff could only wait for the outcome of the climb. Engines had been run hard. Fighters had risen from the field. The unit's answer to the attack was already in the air, committed to interception and to the possibility of ramming. The city below remained the fixed point in every decision. Tokyo could not move away from the bomber route. The 244th could only rise to meet it. The first contact remained unresolved in the sky over the aircraft works. The defenders had not abandoned their vow. They had met the raid with the methods they trusted, and the bombers had forced those methods into a contest of height, time, and endurance. The 244th Sentai's pilots had promised that no formation would cross Tokyo twice. The B-29 service ceiling was 31,850 feet. Long before the first engines turned over at Chofu, the unit had been shaped by the belief that fighters could hold the sky above the capital. December 1941, in the Tokyo region, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force formed the 244th Sentai at Chofu Airfield. Its assignment was direct. The unit would defend the capital's airspace. Its fighters would rise from one field near Tokyo and meet attackers before they reached the city. That mission gave the 244th a clear identity long before American bombers came over the Pacific. It was not a roaming formation. It was Tokyo's fighter shield. At Chofu, the unit's pilots trained for interception as a matter of geography. Warning would come. Engines would start. Fighters would climb toward the approaching force. Concentrated attacks offered the defenders their best chance to break a formation before it reached the capital. When ordinary attack could not close the distance, ramming became the final extension of that faith. A fighter could be spent if Tokyo was spared. Late in 1944, Major Teruhiko Kobayashi commanded the 244th Sentai at Chofu, as B-29 raids brought the war above Tokyo. His men were celebrated because they took off when the capital was threatened. Their reputation rested on that duty, and on the willingness to press an attack into the path of a bomber. Kobayashi commanded fighters built for the defense of one city against aircraft arriving from beyond the home islands. The map had changed around them. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam now placed American B-29 forces within reach of Japan. The 244th waited on a Tokyo field, while the bomber force worked from islands spread across the Marianas. Kobayashi's instruction to his pilots was blunt. They would meet every warning in the air. 3 islands stood behind the bombers. The 27th of January 1945 over Tokyo, the old answer still looked alive. The 244th Sentai rose again toward B-29s approaching the capital. Tokyo received warning. Chofu's fighters launched. The defenders had not abandoned climbing interception, concentrated attack, or the belief that nerve could overcome the distance between fighter and bomber. For Kobayashi, another scramble meant the unit still possessed its purpose. The raid gave that belief fresh support. The 244th could still put aircraft into the sky over its assigned city. Its pilots still pursued the bombers, rather than watching helplessly from the ground. The American force was present above Tokyo, but the Japanese defenders read the immediate problem through the method they already knew. Get airborne, gain height, close, attack. That was enough to harden confidence. A home defense unit did not measure success by the distance to Saipan, Tinian, or Guam. It measured the moment when engines answered the alarm and fighters cleared the runway. The American bomber force had crossed the sea again, but the 244th still had a field, a command, and men willing to climb toward it. In late January, the Marianas remained far from Tokyo, yet their presence appeared in each new warning. B-29s did not arrive as a lone intruder that could be studied and dismissed. They returned to the capital's horizon. The defenders treated each approach as another contest over the city, one that courage and a direct attack could still settle. Major Teruhiko Kobayashi held to a simple order. His pilots would rise whenever Tokyo called. The route from the Marianas ran 500 miles to Tokyo. The 10th of March 1945, at Tinian, the American force prepared a different kind of pressure for Tokyo. That night, the capital's defenders faced B-29s approaching in darkness and at low altitude, where the familiar daylight climb no longer governed the fight. The 244th could still launch, yet a formation of 334 B-29s came against one capital. The number of fighters in the air no longer answered the number above the city. On the 10th of March, at Chofu Airfield, Major Teruhiko Kobayashi committed the 244th Sentai to the nighttime response. His consequence was immediate and countable. The unit had to answer a raid of 334 B-29s under a sky that denied it the daylight attack it had practiced. Tokyo's defense still possessed aircraft and pilots, but the raid had changed the terms under which they could be used. The 25th of May 1945, in Tokyo, Kobayashi faced another major B-29 attack on the capital. The earlier alarms had not ended the American presence. This time, 464 B-29s were dispatched against Tokyo. The consequence was different from the March launch. The capital's air defense crews had to man another citywide warning after a force larger than the March formation had already crossed the same target. Kobayashi did not speak of surrender. He ordered the defense to adjust and remain ready. But the arithmetic remained in the sky. The 244th could take off, and Tokyo could still burn beneath the bombers. 464 aircraft had been dispatched against the capital, and another warning would still find the defenders waiting. At Tinian's North Field, the 313th Bombardment Wing worked on aircraft that had already made Tokyo a repeated destination. Crews refueled, armed, inspected, and returned B-29s to the flight line. The Japanese defenders could not reach that field. Their responsibility began only when the raid warning reached Tokyo, after the bomber force had already crossed the Pacific. The difference now appeared in the work waiting at Chofu. A warning no longer meant one contest whose outcome could settle the next day. It meant engines started after earlier alarms, pilots sent back into darkness after earlier sorties, and ground personnel preparing fighters whose city had already absorbed previous attacks. The 244th Sentai lost the freedom to treat an interception as a single decisive engagement. Its readiness became something consumed between raids. Tokyo also lost the defensive space that had made visual interception possible. Fires, damaged communications, blacked out streets, and crowded emergency routes changed the ground beneath every scramble. Air defense crews still passed warnings. Fighter units still launched, but the capital below them was no longer an intact field of reference from which a defender could judge one approach, one target, and one return route. Each attack left the next response more dependent on damaged systems. At North Field, 4 runways gave the bomber force room to stage aircraft, recover them, and prepare another mission without asking Tokyo's defenders for permission. That capacity did not remove the 244th from the sky. It made its pilots answer an enemy cycle they could not interrupt. A fighter could climb into one alarm. It could not prevent the next force from being fueled far beyond Japanese reach. The strain reached beyond aircraft. The 244th had to preserve trained pilots, maintain fighters, receive warnings, and rise over a capital whose air defense burden kept widening. Every sortie required the same men to return, ready enough for another alarm. Every damaged district reduced the conditions under which the unit had once expected to fight. The loss was not courage. It was the ability to restore home defense before the next demand arrived. The 244th Sentai could only reckon that Tokyo was calling its pilots back into the cockpit again. 4 runways at North Field kept the American departure cycle intact. The burden now rested on a defense that could launch but could not end the sequence. On the Tinian flight lines, The answer to Tokyo's contradiction was visible in the work between raids. The B-29 force did not need one perfect operation. It needed aircraft returned to service, crews assigned, fuel loaded, bombs prepared, and a command able to send the next formation toward the same capital. The 244th had mistaken repeated approaches for separate challenges because it could see only the final stage of the system. The concealed advantage was not merely the bomber's range. 21 Bomber Command possessed protected departure fields, organized maintenance, scheduled crews, and enough runway space to turn recovery into preparation. Tokyo's fighters could disrupt an individual encounter. They could not reach the process that produced the next encounter. That was why a Japanese adjustment could work for one alarm without restoring control over the following week. The 244th responded as a fighter unit should. It continued to scramble, altered its readiness, and accepted night work after the old daylight pattern failed. Its pilots remained available for interception because their command could not leave the capital undefended. But every adjustment took place inside Tokyo's shrinking defensive conditions. The unit was spending trained men in serviceable aircraft at the point of impact, while the American force prepared beyond its reach. That imbalance forced a harder decision. The Japanese defense could no longer reserve its strength for an attack that looked favorable. It had to answer warnings because the target was Tokyo. A fighter held on the ground preserved fuel and machinery, but abandoned its purpose. A fighter launched into an unfavorable interception preserved the mission only by risking the pilot and aircraft needed for the next alarm. The 244th's remaining choice was therefore procedural, not triumphant. It could keep its alert posture, climb when ordered, and hope that a direct attack might still reach a bomber. It could not create a reserve of time between raids. It could not repair the capital's air defense environment from Chofu. It could not compel the B-29 force to fight on Japanese terms. The 244th Sentai's calculation had become that every warning had to be met, whatever the odds. 4 engines carried each B-29 over the capital. The Japanese command was approaching an end that no further adjustment could postpone. In the weeks before Japan accepted defeat, Chofu still had to function as an air defense field. The 244th Sentai remained a unit with aircraft, pilots, orders, and a capital to defend. Major Teruhiko Kobayashi still faced the duty that had defined his command. Warning procedures remained necessary because American bombers could still approach Tokyo. The final approach to the break was therefore not dramatic at first. It was administrative. Alerts, maintenance, fuel, and men waiting for orders. The unit's mission had narrowed into a demand it could not satisfy. The 244th could send fighters upward, but it could not return Tokyo to security. It could prepare for another interception, but it could not restore the defensive space damaged by the raids already endured. Its pilots had once measured their role by whether they could meet an attacker above the capital. Now the command had to preserve a force while the capital remained exposed. Kobayashi survived the war. That fact made the ending different from the ramming legend that had surrounded the 244th. There was no invented final duel in which the unit reclaimed the sky. The break came through the end of Japan's ability to continue the war, while the fighter unit still stood under orders it had been unable to fulfill. The 15th of August, 1945, Tokyo received Japan's acceptance of defeat. The 244th Sentai's Imperial Japanese Army mission ended with that decision. Its fighters had not been destroyed in one final engagement. Its command had not been relieved by a recovered defense line. The capital's home defense unit was simply left without the state mission that had required it to rise whenever the alarm sounded. The American campaign had imposed the position in which that ending arrived. Protected Marianas bases had allowed recurring B-29 attacks. Those attacks had forced repeated readiness on Tokyo, damaged the city the 244th was assigned to cover, and denied the unit any lasting restoration of control above its own capital. Japan accepted defeat while that burden remained unresolved. The numbers were already on the record of the raids. Tokyo had faced formations counted in the hundreds. The 244th had been a single home defense Sentai, tied to one field near the capital. Its pilots could be